The data mesh paradigm is a strong candidate to supersede the centralized data lake and data warehouse as the dominant architectural patterns in data and analytics. It promotes the concept of domain-focused data products which go beyond sharing of files and towards guarantees of quality and acknowledgement of data ownership. Through personal experience with applying the data mesh concept in practice, as well as dedicated field research, the two presenters discovered the most common pain points at different stages of the journey and identified successful approaches to overcome those challenges. It is now my honor to welcome Max Schulze, Data Engineering Manager at Zalando, and Ari Fieder, Professor of Software Engineering at the University of Applied Science for Technics and Economics, Berlin. The stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Perfect. So then let me quickly share my screen and welcome everyone. So thanks for attending this session. Fantastic. All right. So as we've just been introduced, this session is called Data Mesh in Practice: How to Set Up a Data-Driven Organization. My name is Ari Fieder. I'm a software engineering professor at HTW Berlin. I'm also a technology consultant with ThoughtWorks, which is a global IT consultancy for which I used to be the head of data and AI in Germany before I moved back to academia. Here with me today is Max Schulze. He's a data engineering manager at Zalando, where he's leading a data platform team. He's a great data mesh advocate and also a retired semi-professional Magic the Gathering player. All right, so this talk is structured very simple. First, I will give you a bit of an idea what the data mesh is and what it's about. And then Max is going to tell you a bit about how companies are embarking on that data mesh journey. And then we might have a few minutes for Q&A. So before we go into the topic of data mesh itself, let's talk a little bit about the status quo. And that status quo mostly means that you and your company, that you have either a data warehouse or a data lake setup, or maybe even both, because those are currently the dominant architectures for analytics data. Now, interestingly, when you look at those two architectures, the data warehouse and the data lake, from afar, from kind of a 20K feet perspective, then they look very similar, right? You have a lot of data sources on the one side, or data producers, as we call them. Then you have a central storage, and all those data producers are ingesting data in that central storage system. And then on the other hand, on the other side, you have a lot of data consumers who want to do something with that data. And similarly, the issues or the pain points that we see are also very similar, no matter whether you have a data warehouse or a data lake setup. So for instance, something that we see really often is that there is a disconnect between producers and data consumers. So for instance, often they do not even know each other directly. And this, among other things, leads to an unclear data ownership and an unclear responsibility situation. That means, for instance, that there are data sets where it's not really clear who owns those data sets and who is responsible, for instance, for their quality. And this specifically becomes an issue when the number of data sources is growing, especially if it's proliferating. That means if the diversity of data sources is growing. And on the other side, the number of data users or data consumers is growing simultaneously. This is basically when this centralized model starts to fall apart. And one particular sign or symptom where we can see this falling apart is often quality or quality control. Because we have learned that centralized data quality or quality control doesn't scale very well, because in such a situation where you need to scale, it will either slow everyone down or you need to just let the quality go down. Now, why is this an issue no matter whether you have a data lake or a data warehouse setup? Well, the reason lies in the centralization itself, right? Imagine that you have such a centralized data platform with central data ownership, and then on the left you have a lot of data sources and data producers, and on the right you have a lot of data consumers. Now, imagine that among those data producers, there is a checkout service, right? So it's a service that takes care of checkouts, and this is maintained by a team. And whenever there is a checkout happening, a checkout event is generated, and those checkout events, they end up in the central data platform. And because this is a centralized data platform, these checkout events now belong to the data platform, and they are owned, for instance, by the team that maintains this central data platform. Now, the problem here in this situation is that the boundaries of responsibility cut through domain or through domain boundaries or through the domain. So when you look at it, the domain or the knowledge about checkouts is now scattered across several teams. And this will lead to misunderstandings, will lead to frustration, and ultimately create friction. And this friction is not so much an issue when you have only a few data sources and a few data consumers, but it's exactly that friction which prevents the centralized model from scaling when the number of sources and consumers is growing rapidly. And so this is exactly what the data mesh is tackling. The data mesh is a decentralized approach to data architecture that applies three concepts that have already been applied successfully in the past to general production IT, but applies them to data architecture. And those three are: first, product thinking for data; second, domain-driven design that is applied to distributed data here; and third, platform thinking that is specifically applied to data infrastructure. And I'm going to go through them now one by one. So we start with data as a product. So what does it mean to treat data not as a byproduct, but as the product? Well, you need to think about a data set like a physical product that you want to sell. So you need to answer questions such as, what is the market, right, of this data product? What are or who are my customers and what are their desires? But also things like, how do I do marketing, right? How do I make sure that people even know about the data that I'm offering? And usually we're talking about internal customers here, right? And then ultimately, are my customers happy, right? And so you want to build what is called a data product in data mesh terminology with a cross-functional team that has all the resources and capabilities to provide this data product to their internal customers. And among, let's say, a data engineer, maybe a data scientist, etc., in that cross-functional team, you also want to have a dedicated data product manager in this team because otherwise it's pretty hard to tackle those questions thoroughly. Now coming to the second concept that is applied here, which is domain-driven design. And applying domain-driven design here means that you want to make sure that such a cross-functional team that builds a data product, or maybe even several data products, that they become domain experts for one specific domain or subdomain, right? You want to build up expertise so that these people really become the go-to people for certain topics and present the single source of truth for that particular domain or subdomain. Now, a few more things need to be in place for this to actually be a data product in the sense of the data mesh paradigm. So first of all, data products need to be discoverable. They need to be addressable, self-describing, secure, and trustworthy. And most importantly, they need to be interoperable. And when you have these things in place, then such data products that are centered on specific domains can serve as building blocks to build what we call a data mesh. And kind of what we call more like source-oriented domains. So those are domains that are closer to where the data is generated. But you can also have what we call aggregated data domain products. Those are data products that build on top of other data products and basically generate some added value on top. And then finally, let's come to the third concept here, which is applying or building a self-service data infrastructure platform to support all of this. And the general idea here is very similar to what the cloud providers, for instance, are doing for years. You build a set of global services that make it easier for those decentralized data product teams to build data products, to provide their data offering. So you want to build services that make it easier for them to build those things. And the key thing here is that such a data infrastructure platform is what we call domain agnostic. That means it's important that when you are, for instance, a developer building that data infrastructure platform, that you must never know details about a specific data product and a specific domain, because otherwise you risk that the data infrastructure platform becomes a centralized data platform again, and then you end up in a similar situation as with the data warehouse or the data lake paradigm. So to sum up things very quickly, what the data mesh is. The data mesh is a paradigm shift towards decentralization that is based on product thinking, domain-driven design, platform thinking, and finally setting up a federated global governance. And this is something that I didn't talk about here for time reasons. Importantly, what the data mesh is not, it is not a detailed framework or solution to be implemented. It's really more of a mindset shift that you can implement in a different way depending on your requirements and your particular situation. And with this, I hand it over to Max to tell you a bit about how companies are starting on that journey.
Thank you so much, Arif. That was a great introduction of the data mesh topic in general. And what I want to share with you now for the rest of the session is to really take a more detailed look on how this journey can potentially look like. We've been talking to a lot of different companies that are very active in the space to really identify what are like the common pain points, as well as some of the best practices and good tips for production setups. And these are exactly the things that we want to share now. Looking at the data mesh journey, we are trying to break this down into three main steps that most of the companies are taking that going this direction. The first one is, of course, getting started, starting with like the mindset shift that Arif so well described, and making sure that the right ideas are fostered in a scale for the whole company. Then there's the whole step about scaling the mesh, where you really want to build up on top of these data products that you have constructed and really scale this out to the full company. And then lastly, there's the whole part about organizational alignment and making sure that these things still have the interoperability that we have discussed before. For getting started, how usually every company starts with a status quo. We all start somewhere, we all have a data setup, and a lot of the times this is exactly what Arif has already described. We are starting with like centralized data stores. We are having a lot of these pain points that have been discussed already, like the consumers and the producers not really knowing each other, not talking to each other, really unclear data ownership, which is creating a lot of problems and a lot of issues when it comes to actually trying to work with data. Now, how to address some of these pain points? The first thing is, of course, as Arif already rightfully stated, we need to achieve a data product-centric mindset shift. And the first thing that we can advise here is to bring in a culture where people try to understand the different perspectives. Of course, there are different players that are involved into the data setup, the producers, the consumers, the infrastructure team. And it's important to not just blame the other side whenever something is going wrong, whenever the data producer has introduced a breaking change that I am now suffering from as a consumer. No, it's much more important to understand what are the reasons behind that, and that these teams are, of course, not doing this because of malintention and because they want to hurt me, but much rather because they also have packed roadmaps. They are not aware of the dependencies that actually exist, and to understand that starting an open communication and open conversation to collaborate with those teams is the important way to go here. Secondly, you need to create incentives to also bring the people into the position to want to help you. The first part is, of course, you can do this in a communication setup. For instance, when I'm publishing a new feature that is based on top of data that is provided by another team, let's make sure that when I announce this feature to my stakeholders, I also thank the team that I actually depend on here, so that they have some good press in the company as well, and that they have good incentives of also allowing to collaborate moving forward and moving further. But of course, this can also go into the direction of monetary incentives. Right? So whenever there's a team where I can say, if they improve the quality of their data product, I can generate $500,000 of additional value for my company. Then I can make a pretty clear business case of allowing them to hire another engineer or a product person to now take care of the data improvements, which otherwise, because of capacity constraints, the team could have not. And last but not least, it's important to start small. When you bring in the idea of the data mesh, it's important that you do not try to force this on top of your organization and do everything at once, but start with like small proof of concepts with single teams that already have an advanced mindset in terms of trying out new approaches and trying things a different way. And when you then have localized setups that work very well, you can use these as convincing points for other teams to move into the same direction. Starting this and starting slowly rolling this out from one team to maybe 2, 3, a couple more, you will eventually reach the point where you say you have the basic setup, you have enough teams that go into this direction, and you get into the position that you want to extract some infrastructural capabilities from that. And that's exactly where we go into the direction of scaling the mesh. Again, some of these centralization challenges that Arif mentioned before, of course, if you now extract some infrastructure capabilities and again bring yourself into the position that you always take care of everything, you again get to the problem and fall into the trap of taking centralized responsibility about data. This will again lead to situations where you have no explicit ownership, where the data quality guarantees are really going down, but most importantly, where again, the central team is becoming the bottleneck. So how to actually set up a proper data infrastructure platform exactly in these ways that have been described already? Well, I'm just sharing like a very short example here, which is in my company, we were coming from the situation that there were lots of different teams that were working on use cases that required them to operate a Spark cluster. What they did is every day a new team and a new person came in and needed to reinvent the wheel. A new data scientist was hired and spent 90% of his time of setting up an infrastructure. We completely centralized this part and said, this is something that over 50 teams already need by now. We want to provide this infrastructure centrally. But instead of taking care of all these parts for these teams, we provided it in a way where we stayed data agnostic and we provided it in a self-service way to allow for standardization of the tooling. Because we set it up in a way that there were very easy templates on how to get such a cluster, where you just provide a couple of parameters and maybe a couple additional things that you need, libraries or things like that. But you would be in the position that once you have everything set up in place, you can do whatever you want, and that's the rest that you go into. Quickly going over the last step, when we come to also organizational alignment, of course, I can again be in the position that I have different data products that are perfectly set up and have all the things that we've described before, but I cannot use them together. I would run into situations where I have unaligned data products, missing interoperability, and I'm creating data silos. And this is exactly the part where we want to move towards federated governance. We need to bring the people to the same table to really talk together, not only the people from the different domains, but also people from, for instance, the senior management, as well as the infrastructure platform, to, on the one hand side, still leave localization of domain internal concerns, but still have people that talk together and work towards standardization of global processes. That's it for today. I want to thank you a lot. This was Data Mesh in Practice, how to set up a data-driven organization.